This is House Planning Help, episode 353. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down some of the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, we're heading down to the National Self-Build and Renovation Centre in Swindon and getting a range of tips for a passive house project. We often include a resource at the beginning of the episode, and I think it makes sense today to be the National Self-Build and Renovation Centre. And this is somewhere you can go, actually a range of moments during a self-build project. I suppose you could go there even before you're committed 100% as a day out. You could go back to attend a course or one of their shows, and then you might even go another time just looking for something, maybe a specific piece of expertise or a certain product. So we definitely recommend that this should be on your research route, but possibly you're going to be in and out of that. So everyone you're going to hear today had some involvement with the Passive House workshop event. I've been a speaker at the workshops before, and it was lovely to come back again. This time, scarily reflecting on 5 years since I completed my project. But it was a fun thing and put together another presentation. So I always enjoy being part of this. Always, yes, I'll do that if I can. So I thought I would take advantage of being down there to intercept a few people who are all involved in some respect with what was going on that day, that Passive House workshop. We'll work our way through the various pieces of advice. They won't be in any particular order. If anything, it will be random. I suppose one thing I was worried about was that everyone would want to tell me the same thing and be upset if they were last in the queue. As it happened, no, it all turned out fine. Everyone had something different to say. I suppose it depends about your product or service as to how you see this and what advice you'd like to give. So it's fine. Let's get going then. I'm going to bunch them up so we'll have a few audio sound bites together. And in our first batch, we're going to start with Anna Carton, associate at Passive House Homes, then move on to Gordon Bunker, owner at Worcester Renewables, and after that it'll be Neil Turner, UK technical manager for ecological building systems.
I think my top tip would be to try and integrate the Passive House standard as early as possible into your project, preferably pre-planning. That's the most cost-effective way to do it. It's going to save you time both on design fees and also construction costs, and make sure that you're heading down the most efficient route for construction from a very early stage.
And what about the reverse of what you've just said? If I am some way into the design process and I suddenly like the idea of Passive House, what then?
So it's not impossible to convert a standard design into a Passive House design, for example, after you've got planning permission. That's not impossible. It's just potentially more difficult. You might have made decisions, aesthetic decisions, or you might have chosen a particular type of material that just might introduce some challenges around thermal performance that had you known about before, you could have seen those off. So we often get clients coming to us after planning because we produce a construction system that can be applied to any house for it to achieve the Passive House standard. And things that we see crop up are high glazing percentages, for example. And then obviously you're then looking at adding on external shading, which is extra cost. So that would be one example.
I think the most important thing is to consider all of the aspects that manage the house right at the beginning. Things like your ventilation, your heating, your power generation, how you're going to do that, and engage whoever's helping you on that side of things with the architect as soon as possible, because how you build these into the property has an impact on how the property is built and laid out. There is a lot of equipment that's got to go into an energy efficient house, and accommodating that in a sensible location with a large enough space to cover all the maintenance aspects and things like that is absolutely key. So it should take up, and it's probably going to take up potentially up to 5%, between 3 and 5% of the floor area of the build.
Why does it either get left out or does it shrink?
People seem to prioritise other requirements first. They don't even understand necessarily exactly the scope of equipment that's got to go in there. An MVHR unit takes up a square metre. A hot water cylinder takes up a square metre. If you've got a ground source heat pump with a buffer tank, you've got another 2 square metres gone. So we've just got 4 square metres gone. That's 1 metres long, 4 metres wide, effectively, has just disappeared. That's your utility room as was. So these things need to be accommodated in order that they can be built in at a very early stage, designed in so that the services can be looked after and maintained, and also literally sort of within the whole fabric of the building.
I think one of the critical elements is the importance of budgeting to do some intermediate air tightness tests. So in other words, as soon as you think that you've installed your airtight line, your membranes or your boards and your taping, then do a test before you put on any plasterboard or any other finishes. And that way, when you do the test, these air tightness testers are very experienced and they've got equipment to be able to show you where the leaks are. So it could be smoke guns, or it could be anemometers, or it could be thermal imaging if there's a big temperature difference between inside and outside. And then what you can then do is you can then seal up these tricky areas, and it's always areas like window corners, door openings or pipe penetrations, and you can seal those up properly. And then you then do another test and prove that they're sealed, and then you can then fit your finishes.
And it's probably worth mentioning now that we'll have links to all of these companies in today's show notes, houseplanninghelp.com/353. And where they've popped up on the podcast or in the hub, we'll also have links to that. For example, Gordon Bunker, he was involved with the Kimver retrofit project and featured in one of the videos that we had as part of our in-depth video case studies. So you'll get that if you're one of our hub members. We've also worked with Passivhaus Homes, both in the hub, and also Jay was on a recent podcast, and Ecological Building Systems. They featured on a podcast before. So wherever we have that sort of thing going on, we'll embed it into the show notes. Let's move on to our next clips, and we're going to hear from Rob Bohm, Head of Energy and Sustainability at CLPM. Then move on to Mike Shuffle-Botham, Sales Manager at 21 Degrees. And finally, for this batch of clips, Robin Miller, Director of Beco Wallform.
To me, the most important thing with a passive house top tip is that you really want to go with it, because a passive house is almost a lifestyle choice. It's not a case of, well, this is the kind of house I would like, and I would like it as a passive house. You have to think it from design concept onwards. You don't say, oh, yes, I want a wing here, I want glass here, and I want this, and I want that, and the other, and then, oh, by the way, I want it passive. Because if you do it that way round, it just won't work. So coming off and saying, right, number one, I want a passive house. That has implications on the way it's going to be built, the size, even the orientation and the shape of it. That all has a big impact on that. So I think if you really, really want to go down a passive house route, I applaud you, but it is not for the faint-hearted and has severe limitations on what your eventual choices may be.
Keep it simple. With passive house, particularly from we do windows and doors, but the simpler the styles are kept, the less they will cost, and the better they will perform. I think that goes right the way through passive house. Keep it simple, it'll be cheaper, and it'll perform better.
So why is that a case then? When we've got a window, I'm assuming you're talking about, let's say, mullions, transoms, frame, all of that sort of thing. If we just have a clear sheet of glass, why is that the case that it might be cheaper?
Yeah, the simple thing is, the glass is a better insulator by a long way. So the frame is the worst insulator. So the more frame you put in, the less glass you put in, that's where the difference in the performance comes. But the more frame you put in our case with timber windows, is more joinery, more work, more time. So you put extra cost in to put materials in that are less insulating, and then the final outcome is it performs worse and costs more.
Well, for passive house, it's got to be fabric first. If you get the right fabric, the right quality and the right performance, it makes the rest of the project so much easier. It makes your future lifestyle so much more comfortable. The building fabric, if it performs well, will minimise your energy requirements. It'll make you feel much more comfortable and give you a lifestyle which you really hadn't anticipated before.
So how do you do that then?
You look at the design of the building, the style of the building you want to build. Once you've got that, you can start to look at the room layouts and the configuration, and then you can decide what is the best format of the construction. It could be timber frame, it could be traditional brick and block, it could be, hopefully, insulated concrete formwork, because that is one of the oldest systems in use today, and it performs very well and is increasingly economic in the market today because of the performance it provides.
Now, some people might have some environmental reasons not to be so keen, but does it come into its own in any particular circumstances?
It increasingly is coming into its own environmentally, although at the present time it may not appear to be the case, because polystyrene is a byproduct of oil, but we are using it to create a material which will save many times its own energy value in a useful lifetime. And it also actually protects the concrete structure. Now, concrete is now reducing its carbon footprint quite rapidly. And by 2050, it's certainly the plot that they should be carbon positive. The big thing behind all that is the fact that the combination of our insulation and concrete into an ICF structure enhances the carbon footprint of the overall building.
Robin Miller, Director of Beco Wallform. So we're about halfway through. This could be the perfect opportunity to hit pause, mull over what has been said so far and make yourself a cup of tea. Or shall we crack on? So we'll start with Alan Budden, architect and passive house designer from Eco Design Consultants, Vasilis Yiannopoulos from Internorm, and then finally Ben Collins from Airflow.
My top tip is to keep the shape of the building as simple as possible, which is something that we refer to in Passivhaus circles as the form factor. So this is the ratio of surface area. So that's the floors, the roof, the walls, the area that's losing heat to the atmosphere compared to the floor area. So that helps the ratio work really well. Also, the smaller that surface area is, the better it performs, the thinner the insulation you need to get to passive house, and the less it will cost, because the external walls are your expensive bit. This is a tip that's both new build and renovation. So simple things like moving in the front door. On a Victorian terrace, you may have a recessed front door, maybe about a metre to give it a bit of rain shelter. If you moved your front door to the outside surface, that can, on a passive house, save up to 15% of your heat losses. Much easier to do and to detail and to build and all the rest of it as well. So there's lots of advantages. So keeping that shape is probably the best thing. So taking out that integrated garage, we say, downstairs, all those sort of things. So keeping it simple. Easier to get your airtight as well. Easier to put the insulation on. Just easier all round, I think, and saves money. So win-win-win.
But not boring.
No, I think there is a risk of that. In fact, we helped write a document for the NSB Foundation on shape and form, where we looked at that as one of the topics. So I think you can play around with materials, you can do all sorts of things with the design of the building to make it look good. And to be honest, simple classical shapes can also look good and if you get the proportions right. So it doesn't need to look boring. You can still have fun with the materials and shapes. And even if you do really go to something really wacky, put it into Design PH, and you can do some really wacky shapes and do things with it, and still relatively keep the form factors relatively good, you'll still be okay. Okay, you might need to do a bit more insulation on the walls, a bit thicker, but you can still play around with those shapes and do stuff. It doesn't need to constrain you completely, but at least if you're measuring it, you can know what it is and you can work with those constraints and use it and decide those options.
When you go in the market for passive house windows, always focus on the frame of the windows. It's going to be easy for any window supplier to match the performance specifications you have for the glazing unit. So please focus on the quality and the performance of the frame. And having said that, when you actually focus on the frame, ask yourselves a question. Where is the insulation? If you cannot spot the insulation of the window frame, then think again. It might be a potential big problem. try actually to figure out, try to spot where the insulation on the frame is. What makes the frame of the passive house window as insulated as it needs to be for passive house projects in order to minimize heat loss and in order to increase the longevity of the product.
Do we need Passive House certified windows?
If you have certified passive house windows, you simply get the assurance that the window does what it says. Okay, so the performance, the technical identity of the window is assured by the Passive House Institute that yes, it delivers what the manufacturer says. Okay, strictly speaking, you don't need the window to be certified.
And obviously, when we come to look at windows, we may not have had experience before. So how do we know to assess a good window?
Continuing on what I said before about the insulation of the frame, for instance, if your preference has to do with composite windows, the vast majority of the composite window manufacturers in the UK, they do the basic thing. So they have the aluminium cladding always externally. They have the timber part of the window, of course, internally. In between, there is nothing else but just an air layer, okay? And this is part of the problem. Make sure, for instance, when you go in the market for composite windows, that you can easily see in between the aluminium cladding and the timber part of the window an insulation layer. It could be natural insulation, could be EPS, could be lots of things. What is really, really important is that you can see the insulation there, not just plain atmospheric air, not just an air layer between the exterior part of the window, aluminium cladding, and the interior part of the window, timber, for instance. That's really, really important.
My top tip, speaking on behalf of ventilation, probably put as much thought into the planning as you can. Start looking at potentially what you want to achieve, the possible add-ons obviously for a system. Speak to whoever's going to be doing the install at the beginning to get an idea of obviously what their experience is with it. There's a lot of different products that are out in the market. There's a lot to choose from, and they all offer different features and benefits. Also look at the additional add-ons. So, for example, different things that can be bolted onto the system to effectively bring the cost down even further when it's actually installed. These are things that, again, have to be brought in at an earlier stage, but can offer great benefits and rewards to the end user.
Two themes that come up a lot on this podcast, actually. Making a lot of good decisions early on helps things, and also we heard embracing simplicity. And episode 350 that we recorded recently was all about doing more with less, which very much leans on those two principles. So we'll link that into the show notes as well. And we're on to our last set of clips. We're going to hear from Iga, architect and passive house designer from ACA, talking about budget. No one's mentioned money. That is a key consideration when we're setting our energy performance. We've also got Paul Jennings from Aldas, who has featured on the podcast many times before, air leakage expert. So what will his top tip be? And then a guy called Ben Adam Smith from House Planning Help.
We would certainly ask you for your budget. So quite often this is the key driver when it comes to building your future home. And from that point onwards, we can then guide you on, whether it's worth investing in a passive house. From my perspective, I'm a little bit biased because I'm a passive house designer. I would say always go for it. But yes, we need to consider our client's budget, their aspirations, and long-term plans for the future. And the passive house fits in all of those criteria. So we certainly can provide you with that knowledge and reassurance of designing a low energy home that will provide you all the benefits of, having that comfortable living environment.
Will you encourage people to do a bit less but better? Because if they come in and they want to get to passive house standard, but maybe they don't have the funds for what they desire.
Yes. So what we tend to do, we take a balanced view on it. So we listen to our clients, what they want to achieve, and we not necessarily will be pushing you to get a certification. We will be discussing with you the budgetary constraints and so on and so on. And quite often, if you just follow the passive house principles, which is a fabric first approach principles, you can achieve a really, really good results without, going to the extent of certification. So we certainly have that as an option, that balanced kind of approach.
My top tip is plan ahead, prepare, practice, look at what you're doing, think about design, look for joined upness, Is your airtightness line consistent and joined up? Is it practical? If you're doing any sorts of fancy tapes, you're doing preformed corners, practice. Don't practice on your build, practice before you get to your build.
So all of these sorts of things, at what stage, let's say we're working with someone, do we need to consider?
Well, the earliest stage is the design stage. You're looking at, have you got a continuous airtightness line? Are there any issues? Can you simplify it? Can you make sure your tapes will work or your membranes will work? Personally, I now go away from large amounts of membranes. I use the airtight OSB because I think it's much more robust, but not always the case. And, you know, essentially there are good tapes and there are better tapes, but mostly it's about workmanship. Who's doing it? How well are they doing it? Have they practiced?
I think my top tip would be don't mess with the formula. So if you're tackling a passive house, do all the things that are suggested, follow the process, because it's strange how often you meet people who don't like a certain bit of it and want to go off piste and do their own version. And it just doesn't work because it's almost a holistic approach. So that's one reason that I quite like certification, because it shows that you've done all the bits and that it should work at the end of the process because it's a quality assurance process. Oh, that Ben Adam Smith guy sounded really knowledgeable, didn't he? I thought I'd throw you in a bonus tip because I was there too and I was a speaker. So I thought I would chip in as well and round us up to 12 tips. Of course, there is always more to learn on our website, more to learn with the National Self-Build and Renovation Centre and all of the companies that we've featured today. Thank you so much. Find out more in the show notes, houseplanninghelp.com/353. My call to action is to check out the Hub. And this is the membership community that I run alongside House Planning Help for further support. And it does work particularly well in the early days. So you can sit at home when you've got some spare time, load up, log in, and then watch maybe one of our in-depth video case studies where we've been filming through entire builds just to try to work out, condense down into little nuggets, what is going on here? What decisions are being made? Why do I agree with them? Then we've got our courses. We've also got our live training sessions with guest experts. We've got Ask the Expert, so you can fire questions at people other than me, but I am here each week as part of Office Hours, which is a drop-in call. And then we've got our members only forum. So find out more, houseplanninghelp.com/join. That's it for today. Thank you so much for being there. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.